Welcome to OnScript's Biblical World, a podcast exploring the history, archaeology, geography, and cultures of the Bible. Visit us at onscript.study/biblicalworld.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Biblical World podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. For this episode, we're doing something a little bit different, having video as an option. So whether you're listening or watching, hope you enjoy this version of the Biblical World. And thanks so much to Taylor Churzik for putting in the extra work of producing this video episode. So enjoy, and thanks for sharing the word. And to those of you who give to Biblical World and OnScript, we really appreciate that. Enjoy.
Welcome back, Biblical World listeners. I'm Kyle Keimer. I'm joined by my co-host, Chris McKinny. Chris, how you doing today?
Kyle, I am doing well, and I'm excited for this episode.
Yes, we have a special guest with us today. We're going to be talking about the archaeology of biblical Hebron with kind of the specialist on Hebron, a guy who knows probably more about it than any other living archaeologist, and that's Professor Jeff Chadwick from BYU. So Jeff, thanks for joining us from cold BYU.
Yeah, hey, it is great to be with you here today from Utah. We warmed up just slightly from yesterday, but March has come in like a lion here.
Yeah, well, it's all of 85 degrees here in Texas, so,
I say it's California cold here in California, so it's, 60, which is cold for many Californians.
No, I understand that. We were at 25 degrees when I went out to work yesterday, so we're hoping for it to warm up.
Well, Jeff, it's great to have you on. For those of you in the audience who don't know, Jeff and I know Kyle also knows Jeff for a long time. Whether that's at, going together to the ASOR conference. And for me specifically, long history going back to my very first excavation at Tel Asafi Gath way back in 2009. And Jeff was already a veteran by that point at Tel Asafi. And so it's been great getting to know Jeff over the years. And he's followed our excavation at Tel Burna very closely. And we've done some expeditions on our own to places like Lehi, south of Jerusalem. So Jeff is always such a joy to talk about not only biblical archaeology, but biblical geography, because we share a lot of the same passion about these stories. So very happy, Jeff, to have you on.
Well, great to be with you. And, in terms of a student audience out there, my whole heritage goes back to Mount Zion. So we're glad to be involved.
Right. Well, Jeff, maybe just to even start us off, give us a little of your background of what brought you into archaeology, and then how you got connected with the Hebron excavations and some of the work that was going on there, and that you have kind of taken over.
Well, I got involved really with studies in the land of Israel over 40 years ago in the early 1980s. Arrived in 82, right in the middle of the first Lebanon War, and became immediately fascinated with the land. I was working with a group of students on a study program where we were looking at the Bible in context, historical geography, archaeology, field tripping, literally 2 field trips a week. The type of thing that you just live for. And I was young at the time. I was in my mid-20s. And just grew up with that program, returning every year since then. I'm going to be back for my 42nd year this year. I eventually decided that having got a master's degree in geography of the Near East, that archaeology would be a better way to pursue what I wanted to do in terms of teaching and research. So I began working with archaeological excavations and worked with Hebrew University, with Tel Aviv University, some names that have now gone on, but decided to transfer all that work to the University of Utah. Because A, I got better tuition for a PhD, but B, there was a man there whose name was Philip Hammond, and he gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, if you'll transfer your work from Israel to here and take, a couple of classes from me, I will approve you a dissertation topic for the ages. I said, what is it? He said, I excavated at Hebron in the 60s, and it's never been published, and I'll let you do it for your dissertation. You know how hard it is to get a dissertation approved, and that was hard to turn down. So I took it and made all the difference. Became very close with Philip Hammond, who is really well known for what he did at Petra in Jordan. And that's how it ran. We got the degree, and we worked with a lot of Hebron material, and all of the excavators of Hebron ever since have become good friends, and I know them, and we've shared a lot together. So from Avi Ofer to David Ben Shlomo and Emmanuel Eisenberg, we're all kind of in the fix of Hebron. I'm not the expert on Hebron. I'm one, and I'm probably the expert on the first excavation. But then, looking around for other stuff to do, I excavated at Ekron in the 90s. For 25 years, I've been with Gath and Professor er-Rumeide at BYU, just one of the funnest places there is. Was always tempted to go to Burna with our good friend Itzik Shai, but never been able to get done with Gath. And so we're still working on it today. And I also teach regularly at BYU's Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies, where I'm a professor of archaeology there, and teach and also do field study with students all over Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, Greece. And we do that on a regular basis. I'll be leaving again in August to go for a year and do another 3 semesters with our students. So we're always excited about that too.
That's great. I would just remind our audience that, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so, Kyle and I did an episode on the giants in Judges 1 and their connection with Hebron and the different toponyms that are mentioned there, the sons of Anak. And if you go back to that episode, we discuss a little bit about the history and geography and archaeology of Hebron. But just as a reminder, one of the most important features of all of this is not only the belief and understanding that Hebron is an incredibly important site, it's also incredibly under excavated, understudied, but itself is one of the few that's actually in the Southern Hill Country that has been excavated to any real depth. Like if Hebron and Shechem and Jerusalem are the most important sites in the Hill Country, and maybe Bethel's in there too, we only know a little bit about Hebron, especially when compared to Jerusalem, and especially compared to Shechem. But even that which we know is so precious because all the sites around it, and there are many. If you read Joshua chapter 15, it's surrounded by smaller sites from the kingdom of Judah that have only been touched by survey. And so Hebron is just so significant, not only for what it tells us positively in the Bible, but according to the modern situation, how little we can actually know about the region as a whole. And so that's what makes Jeff's work so important.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that, obviously this is a site that, is in the modern day West Bank. And so there's always, the modern political situation, unfortunately, is a factor that many archaeologists have to work with and deal with. And when we're thinking about excavations that have taken place in the past and then access to some of that material or access to the sites today, it can be quite challenging. So it makes the information, the material that Jeff has and that he's been working with even more important because, as Chris mentioned, it just fills in this gap that we have. And yeah, it'd be fantastic to have a greater picture of the hill country in the South, but that's not the case as it is right now. So Jeff, maybe we'll kick it over to you. And I know you've got some slides, and we're working on developing a visual aspect to the podcast, but we're gonna switch it to you and have you show some things and walk us through the archaeology of biblical Hebron.
Okay, we'll do that right now, and just feel free to poke in with questions or observations as we go along. Okay, can you see that all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, let's take a shot at things here. So first of all, I always like to advertise because there's a lot of people that have kind of put up with me over the years and done a lot for me and actually paid me money to do this. So I'll introduce my home institution. We have a very nice campus on the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus, right beneath Hebrew University, where I've lived for years and taught and and they're a great support to Jerusalem Center for Near Eastern Studies. And then we have a beautiful campus in Utah, which we invite everyone to come visit sometime. It's a delightful place, and we have a reasonably good football team in certain years, and you may have heard of it. And so if you're into that, come out and visit, and we'd love to have you there. And I have a home here on the Utah campus as well. We're here to talk about Hebron, and specifically the finds of the American expedition to Hebron, which was the first archaeological expedition to that major biblical site. It took place over a 3-year period in the 1960s, prior to the Six-Day War of 1967, which changed everything in terms of access. So I'll just mention here a little bit about the site. This is an aerial view of er-Rumeide. You can see the green area. It's generally kind of a round, almost like an 8-acre area. You see in the distance part of the modern city of Hebron, including in the distance the Marat HaMakpelah, the cave of Machpelah, the tomb of the patriarchs over there to the east of the site, before Hebron, as the biblical record states it. And this is a view from just a decade ago, when Emanuel Eisenberg and David Ben Shlomo were excavating right down here in the lower right-hand area on the south side of the tell. You'd all be familiar with the background of Hebron in the Bible, so I don't need to go over that too much. The notion that Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt, that Hebron goes by various names in the Genesis record. Mamre, and the oak of Mamre is mentioned. Kiryat Arba, and Sarah's death at Kiryat Arba, and the bargaining for the cave of Machpelah that you see in Genesis 23. And then, of course, you move from the story of Joseph, who left the Vale of Hebron to go north to Dothan, down to the time of 2 Samuel, where David becomes king in Hebron and was there reigning 7 years and 6 months over Judah, before in 2 Samuel 5, all the elders of Israel come to Hebron and anoint David king over all the tribes, and he moves his headquarters to Jerusalem. In terms of the urban setting, Hebron is well known from inscriptional evidence all over, particularly these stamped seals that we find on Lamelech jars and other various items that have been excavated. Hebron was a very important site in the southern hills, and had a kind of a regional administrative headquarters role, even stretching down into the Shephelah, to the west of Hebron. But it's very well known, and there's no doubt that there was a place called Hebron, and that it was important, and that the biblical record is to a significant degree accurately recalling that memory. So
hey, Jeff, could I ask you a question about I've been to Hebron, the city, many times, and to the cave. I've actually never made it up to Rumeide. So that's on my, my bucket list of things to do. And maybe someday we can, go do that together. That'd be great.
Oh, we ought to, yeah.
I kind of have two broad questions about how the site feels. One is, I clearly tell from aerial photos that it's high and lifted up, and commands this valley, this whole area. But in terms of water sources, I understand that this area is very well watered. In fact, this is kind of even reflected in the biblical text in Numbers, where they have the valley of Eshcol, which is probably around here, and they bring the grapes. But where specifically do you know, if you do know, where the spring is or water source?
Yeah, we know exactly. I've got a little map of it, and it'll be coming up here.
Okay, great. I wanted to ask while you're looking at the aerial, so this is good to know. Thanks.
In terms of on this view, it would be kind of to the other side of the green area there, going down the eastern slope. Which is not unusual that you find the water on the eastern slopes in these hill country places, and that's true of Hebron as it is in Jerusalem. The spring is called Ein Jedida, and it is still used now and again today, even as a mikveh, which I think you'll see. Let me go back to that one right here. This is the situation in 1963 or 64, 65, 66 when Phil Hammond was busy there. Hebron was within the administrative control of Jordan on what the Jordanians called the West Bank area of the Kingdom of Jordan. And Phil had excavated with Jordanian associated excavations for a decade already by the 1960s. He worked with Kenyon at Jericho. And there's some very fun stories that Phil tells about Kathleen Kenyon at Jericho that I'll share someday. But we'll leave that for now. But in 1963, he obtained a license. He was a very young guy. And in 1964 began the first summer season. And then 2 more summer seasons in 1965 and 1966. There was a planned 67 season. It did not roll into place after the June War of that year. And because of Hammond's association with the Jordanians, he never did get back to Hebron. There is Phil Hammond, if you'd like to know who he is. And you see on the left-hand side, there is him. There he is, kneeling on mats at the site. They used to, and this was a Kenyon trick, right? Put out these mats and spread out the pottery right there near the trenches where they dug it, wash it off, categorize it, read it, etc. So there's a very young Hammond in 1965, and then there on the right is a very old Hammond in 2005, after his like almost 40th year at Petra. That was the last season that he dug there. He's actually on oxygen, as you can see from the picture. So that's a long archaeological career associated with the Jordanians. And he was honored by the royal family. This says 50 years of work in Jordan. Actually, it was something more like 60. And just as a throw to Phil, who died in 2008, at Petra, the 2 biggest things you will see when you go through Petra that he did were he excavated the Great Theater that you pass as you go down and come out of the Sikh there. He did that. It was one of the first big excavations at Petra in the early 1960s. And then when he went back to Petra in the late 60s and through the 70s and 80s and 90s, he worked at the Temple of the Winged Lions, which is now undergoing restoration. A huge contribution to everything that he did in Jordan. His giving me access to his Hebron material, and basically he told me that the reason he selected me was that he had come to know that I knew something about the Bronze and Iron Age on the west side of the Jordan River. He wouldn't say Israel. He'd say, you know things that are going on in the west of the Jordan, and I'd like a person to be able to work on it who is savvy enough with the things going on west of Jordan that they won't mess it up. So we wrote the dissertation, had access to all of the pottery, literally, a ton of it that the Jordanians let him bring back to Utah, and published a nice article in Bar about it in 2005. And that resulted just a couple of years before he died. And by the way, if you want to read a nice introduction on Hebron, that Bar article in the September 2005 edition is a nice, public offering. But he decided that he would, after the fact, make me an actual member of the expedition. I had begun what we call the American Expedition to Hebron Publication Project in 2006. And as a result of that and the appearance of the Bar article, he says, I'm going to do 2 things for you. Number one, I'm going to retroactively make you a member of the expedition. So I get to wear the khaki shirt because, as you'll note here, he was into khaki, and everybody wore uniforms on this thing. It was very old school, very Jordan Legion. And so that, by the way, is when I was much younger. That's way back, I think, in the 80s, as I recall, when I was surveying the site 20 years after he had excavated it. And
very important question, Jeff.
Yeah.
Okay. I know you've been, into fitness the last couple of years. Can you still fit into the shirt, and do you still have
No,
it?
no, I actually would have just a little bit of trouble. I'm easily 30 pounds less than I am now in
That's
that
still
picture.
impressive.
That I call that my Nelson Gluck picture, and those of you that know anything about archaeology will know why we hit that. My wife took that of me one day up. This is at the top of Hebron, near what we call er-Rumeide, which was where the summit of the tell was. If David had a royal residence at Hebron that was of any significance, it would have stood where that is. The traditional tomb of Ruth and Jesse are there, but I don't think they would have been buried inside the city, so I don't think that's correct. But we wore the khaki and everything. He says, "All right, you're in. I'm going to make you a member of the expedition," even though in 1963 I was only 8 years old. So that was a great honor for me to have him say that. And when he died, he willed me all of his materials. So I actually own all of his pottery now, all of his records, everything. They're in a big lab that I have at BYU. Here's a view of er-Rumeide here on the left, and you can see that it's really quite roundish. The arrow on the right-hand side, lower right, shows you where the cave of Machpelah is with regard to the tell. It's about 1,000 yards, okay, a kilometer to the east of where the city of Hebron was located. And so what you have here is the biblical description of Machpelah being before Hebron, actually reflected in the real geography of the place. And most visitors, of course, will go see the Tomb of the Patriarchs, the Machpelah cave, but they never get over to the tell, which is it's in the Israeli-controlled area of Hebron, but it's a little dicey to go there, quite frankly, and so a lot of tourists don't make it over there. Here's what it looks like in a more recent picture from the 1980s when I started my main work there. You can see the tell is still not very well built up. There is now a Jewish apartment house here at the northern slope, bottom of the northern slope of the tell. The excavations that have gone on were up here where Hammond dug, and a lot of recent excavation on the south side, along where the city wall ran on the south side. And that arrow then shows where the cave of Machpelah is today, just to give you some ideas here. There's the summit of the tell, which is actually a monastery, probably a Byzantine era monastery, which is called Der Arba'in in Arabic. And it's, as you can see in the Hebrew there, reputed to be the grave of Ruth and Jesse, but I'm not sure that could be possible. On the eastern slope of the tell, you can see a photograph of Ein Jadida, the water source of the tell. And it is still a copious flowing spring today, just like Gihon is in Jerusalem. And it's been, to a degree, the stones around its access have been cemented into place, so it's safe to go there. And you will, from time to time, have people get into the water. Sometimes you'll see intrepid swimmers go there. Sometimes it will be some of the Jewish residents of the region coming over to use it as a mikveh. But it was a very good water supply for the city. And there are some arrows showing you the location of Ein Jadida on the eastern slope of the tell, and Der Arba'in, which is in the middle of the upper summit of the tell. So that's er-Rumeide there, and it's a nice aerial shot that you can get an idea of what it looks like. Here is the topographical terrace map that Hammond made, and which I went ahead and updated of how the tell works. Not a topographical map in terms of elevations, but where the terrace walls ran, so that you can see actually the features. There are a few houses up there today where some of the modern Arabs there live and have a vineyard or two, have a few olive trees. But what you see here on this map is where the various excavations have worked over the last 60 years. And in the orange are all the areas, except for Area 2, which would be off to the right-hand side of the map, of the Hammond expedition, the American expedition to Hebron. On the tell, there were actually 3 areas dug, and part of a 4th, Area 3, within the wall line of the city, and most notably Area 1 and Area 6. Area 6 was the nearest the summit of the tell, a long trench that kind of determined some of the stratigraphy over the long period. And then we have in green the areas which were excavated by Avi Ofer and the Tel Aviv University excavation for 3 years in the 1980s, 84, 85, 86, just exactly 20 years after Hammond's efforts. And it ceased there because of the Intifada, which began in 1987. Ofer did not wind up returning in 88 and as he had planned, and that expedition was abandoned. But they found some nice corroborating material from the things that Hammond had done in several other areas 20 years earlier. Then the blue areas were the areas that were excavated in 1998 and 1999. In 1998, Yuval Peleg excavated a tomb, which is noted there right at the top of the visual, a little circle in blue with P in it. Peleg's tomb. It was a late Bronze Age tomb, which was very significant that he found a good late Bronze Age burial material very close to the tell, very close to the outside of the wall of the tell, because in the other larger blue area at the top of the visual there, you see a large area that was excavated by Emanuel Eisenberg of the Israel Antiquities Authority in 1999 in preparation for the building of the Jewish apartment complex that would be erected essentially over the top of it. And that area has been left as an open archaeological park underneath the building. And it's accessible from the outside so that you can go and see, and I'll show you here, 2 different segments of city wall that Eisenberg found, the Middle Bronze Age wall and the Early Bronze Age wall, running more or less parallel to each other, plus the iron remains of a 4-room house, Iron Age remains of a 4-room house, and other things that were picked up in this emergency rescue expedition before this apartment house was built. So that's a big picture into the Bronze and Iron Age in that area that really helped out, particularly even in terms of our understanding of what Hammond did. Because down here in Area 3 in the south, we have city walls abutting each other that we can confidently date to the Middle Bronze Age and the Early Bronze Age. So the wall line would have come kind of around the tell like this, so to speak. And then there was one more excavation effort in 2014. Eisenberg was joined by our friend David Ben Shlomo of Ariel University for an expedition along the southern edge, and I've just outlined in yellow here the large areas 53A and 53B that Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo excavated. 53A excavating a very large area of the Roman and Herodian period on what would have been the outside of the Iron Age wall remains. Hebron was robustly settled in the Herodian period. There are buildings, pottery shops, mikvahs, everything that can be seen there. And then he and Eisenberg worked on revealing more of the face of the Middle Bronze Age city wall that Hammond had first found in Area 3 back in the 60s. And so you get a big stretch of that Middle Bronze wall that's visible here and some more of it up here now as a result of that work that went on just 10 years ago. And all of that was in preparation to open this entire area as a visitor's park to the tell, mostly sponsored by the Jewish population there in Israeli-controlled portion of Hebron. So that's what's been done in excavations over a 50-year period from 1964 to 2014. Surprisingly, the entire picture reveals more excavated areas than most people would think of when they think of Tel Rumeide Hebron, but it also gives us a very good look at the archaeological history of the site. Here is the archaeological history according to the Hammond expedition, and all of that has been understood better because of the subsequent expeditions. And I've got this exactly the way you would have it if you dig it, with the Byzantine and Arab monastic and agricultural presence on top there, the Roman, Herodian, Hellenistic, Hasmonean as part of the unwalled community that still sat there 1,000 meters to the west of the cave of Machpelah in the Second Temple period, and then down to the Iron Age and the Late Bronze and Middle Bronze strata, which were the biblical city of the Old Testament that figures so prominently in the lives of Abraham and Jacob, and even Joseph will leave the Vale of Hebron. But then bouncing down through the visit of the spies to Hebron at the end of the Late Bronze Age, where they encounter the huge walls that stretch up to heaven, so to speak, and then the continuation of that city and the city wall into the Iron Age, right down until the Babylonian captivity. There was also this robust early Bronze III urban entity at Hebron with an early Bronze Age wall around it, which was the contemporary of the large early Bronze city that we have at Tel Yarmut, the large early Bronze city presence that we have at Tel Savi-Gath, and other early Bronze Age communities in the southern Levant at the time. So it's a robust stratigraphy, if you will.
Now, Jeff, can I jump in for a second on that last slide with the chart there? Just two things I want to kind of draw out for the listeners, and particularly if they can view the presentation as well. Number one is you've got this massive Middle Bronze wall that seems to change the topography, or at least leave this impression then that has ramifications for what the Late Bronze and the Iron Age and even later occupation of the settlement looks like, and even informs the kind of the lay of the land, if you will, today, which is something that we see at sites throughout the Israel, the southern Levant, the West Bank, that in the Middle Bronze Age, they're building these enormous Cyclopean style walls that you're not going to take down, but they end up getting reused and reused and reused over the generations, and they're visible today in many places. So just the first comment there. And the second one is that I noticed you have a Late Bronze layer in there. And
yes,
for those that maybe have read a little bit on Hebron and seen some of the publications, they might be saying, wait a second, I didn't think Hebron was occupied in the Late Bronze Age, because there are some publications out there that say it wasn't. They say Hebron was, it was a Middle Bronze, then it was nothing in the Late Bronze Age, then it's reoccupied in the Iron Age. But you actually have good evidence, and you already mentioned one tomb, but you have more evidence from Hammond's work as well that no, there clearly was a Late Bronze Age settlement here.
Well, there was a thriving Late Bronze Age settlement. Let me just show you some of the fun things that happened to be in my hands there, and you will recognize this very well. Is just a drop in the bucket of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of indicative sherds that were found in situ by the Hammond expedition and by others. Okay. Eisenberg, in that big rescue dig on the north side of the Tell, got painted Late Bronze Age pottery. And everything that you read up until about, the mid 2000s, right? Everything coming up, and it was written by everyone from Finkelstein to our friend Bill Deaver, assumed that there was no LB at Hebron, and that, of course, was always used in some of the polemic about the biblical story and whether you could have had Hebron be a viable site for the spies to come to and see a wall that stretched up to heaven, etc. But Hammond had robust LB finds, and I published them in my dissertation, and that's where they first start to leak out. With the Barr article in 2005, it really began to leak out, and then when we started to work with the archaeology community to help things, the publications began to change. I'm going to show you that here. But the biggest problem we have with the LB at Hebron was that Avi Ofer had a disposition against agreeing to what he found. In his Area S, which was very famous for a Middle Bronze Age house with a sheep tablet in it, a cuneiform tablet that reported the sale of sheep. That house also continued into the Late Bronze Age. But Avi, bless his heart, just did not have the vision coming from the Tel Aviv school that Hebron should be regarded as a Late Bronze site. And so while he reported in Excavations and Surveys in Israel, Volume 6, that out of Area S, in that house, which had transitioned from the Middle Bronze Age forward. He found, quote, bowls and decorative designs typical of the end of the late Bronze Age in a stratum of the early 12th century or perhaps even the late 13th century BCE, unquote, which pretty much tells you you've got a robust late Bronze stratum there. When he later published his article in the New Encyclopedia of Archaeological Excavations, he said, quote, during the late Bronze Age, the city of Hebron was abandoned, and made no reference to his own find of the LB pottery there. I like Avi a lot. He was very willing to share everything that he had and excavated with me. But when I saw these things, I says, Avi, I'm just going to have to take a different stance than you've taken here, because you are finding the same thing that Hammond found 10 meters away in his trench number 1, where he had a robust LB presence, and 40 meters away, 50 meters away in trench 6, where he also had a robust LB presence. So there's Ophir's trench. And there I'm circling with my arrow, if you can possibly see it there, the so-called tablet house, which he dated to the Middle Bronze Age, and which I think we can clearly say now transited into the LB. So I put LB in brackets here in Ophir's stratigraphy because he leaves it out, but I've added it because his descriptions clearly suggest that it was there.
Can I jump in real quick and
You
just
bet.
add something to this? I think what's so helpful about the way you're talking about this, Jeff, is not just to think about the history of this site in terms of its excavations, what we find in antiquity, but also with every one of these sites that have been excavated, there's kind of a stratigraphy of the history of research that has to be considered when you approach this. That's the baseline to approach. And so when you were showing, looking at Avi Ophir here, just to highlight your point that he is an incredibly important figure, even though he's not as well known perhaps today, he's the only reason why we know anything about all of the Iron Age sites in the hills. I mean, he is the one who surveyed. I mean, in my dissertation, I used his research together with Yehuda Dagan's research in the Shvela to be able to look at where these sites are and when they were occupied. So knowing now what you know about his inclination to be a bit anti-LB for whatever reason that might be, it helps even myself trying to reconstruct how we can use these types of reports, but to show even the context of that time period of being able to excavate it in the 80s before the first Intifada happens. It's really similar to the changes we have archaeologically from EB to MB. Like there's these big events. Now they're on a small scale in terms of time, but they impact the history of research in some really particular ways. You've talked about the 6-Day War, or the first Intifada, the second Intifada, these types of things. And so I think it's helpful for our listeners to compare that we almost always have to have these two histories in mind, the modern one and then the ancient one. And
right.
the other point,
archaeology of archaeology.
yeah, exactly. And the other point that I wanted to bring out with the late Bronze Age is part of the reason why I think people have been pushing back against late Bronze Age is because apparently Hebron isn't mentioned in Amarna. And so in the Amarna correspondence to the 14th century, although, maybe there's theories out there that says that it is. And I just have been struck recently by all the discussion happening around Jerusalem, the Cyclopean walls that we have around the Spring Tower and the fortifications there, the recent report of the moat, and these same ideas of late Bronze Age occupation. And in the case of Jerusalem, where we have very little in terms of late Bronze Age remains, and yet we have these Amarna correspondence tablets. So therefore, Jerusalem has to be important. And here you have kind of the opposite. You have actually a lot of Bronze Age remains and not a whole lot in terms of Amarna letters, or nothing except this one tablet that you're mentioning here. And so it's just interesting to see the way that scholars are pulled in different directions by these different types of evidence, and what these things that lie behind why they argue certain ways about a Hebron or Jerusalem. So it's interesting to see, again, that trajectory across this period of time as we go from the 1980s until now, and some shifting perspectives on these two sites, Jerusalem and Hebron, that are closely connected around these ideas.
You know, I began introducing Hammond's LB at Hebron to the academic community just a few years before Phil's death. And I did a big project in 2003, rereading all of Phil's pottery. And you can see there some of the late bronze ceramics. In one of the photos, you can see a scarab of Ramses II, which was found in C2 in a great late bronze stratum in Area 6. All of the maps. And when we presented these at ASOR in 2004 and began speaking with people about them, it changed the landscape. I was able to convince Anson Rainey that we did have LB, and that resulted in changes in the way that he presented things. You now see in his works LB as Hebron as an LB site. But if you're going back to before the year 2000, you weren't finding that in any publications. And so it's made a difference to get this information out there. I'm very glad in retrospect that Hammond asked me to transfer to Utah, just because this wouldn't have been out there otherwise. It would never have been published, because he wasn't going to publish it. He didn't feel really like it was in his interest to publish stuff that was under the control of Israel. So he had somebody that's friendly to Israel do it, and that's important. Here, by the way, is the trench that's just a few meters away from Avi Over's trench that Hammond dug in 1964, his Area 1, where you have the walls of a Middle Bronze Age transiting into the Late Bronze Age house, which were found, walls 5 and 11. And you can see a drawing of some of the LB types of pottery that you found in the LB floors that ran to the walls of this structure. And so it was clearly there and clearly mirroring the same things that Ofer found in 1984 through 86 that he didn't want to call an LB presence. Now, I like Avi a lot. He's actually left archaeology. He left it a long time ago, and it's our loss, really, because his survey material in the hill country was really good. But like you say, Chris, you will have to go back and factor in a bias against LB that may be visible in the way that the surveys of some of those other sites were interpreted. And there are views of some of the other LB pottery that come out of this place, just the common pottery, you know, the rims, the painted, the ridgings, the types of things. That same trench had an Iron Age house, probably a pillared courtyard, you know, 4-room house, built over the MBLB house when you get to the Iron 1 and 2 strata. And so here you see the same trench with the Bronze Age walls on the left and the Iron Age walls on the right, walls 4 and 8. And we actually have some surviving photos of that. They were very, very precious with film in the 60s. That's one of the things that's hard about this, is you don't have all of the great shots that we take now, because they just weren't thinking in those types of terms. It would be lovely to have something from every angle. But here's the Iron Age house, and there's Phil kneeling in it next to the pillar that held that up there. And there is the plan, and you can see how that works out with the surviving photo. And behind it, the mortar that was used. I have a theory now on what these mortars are used for, and I announced some of that at ASOR last year, and I'll be talking about it further. I think they're probably used for household oil production. But in any case, robust Iron Age finds going right down to the end of Iron 2. We go over to the trench called Area 6 on the north summit, near the summit of the Tell, near Der Arba'in. You've got wonderful stratigraphy that goes all the way from the early Bronze Age up through the middle, up through the late, up through both the Iron Age periods, 1 and 2, and also down coming through into the Herodian period. in all of that. You can see the careful way that Phil was digging here, the very Kenyon-esque methodology, almost a bulk tag overkill. But in retrospect, as I tried to deal with all of this as a grad student, getting into PhD ready, it was very instructive. I became a big fan of wall tags, of bulk tags, because of this, because we got so much out of it. So here's the stratigraphy in Trench 6. Okay, you've got the EB there, and you've got two phases of it. You've got a bunch of MB-LB, including multiple layers of LB, LB1, LB2A, LB2B, and a destruction level. This, I can't, emphasize how important this is, that you have at least localized destruction at Hebron at the end of the LB2. And it is in that destruction, and there you can see then the subsequent Iron Age going down Iron 1 through Iron 2C in the trench. But is that destruction in those squares that are at the top of the trench that we find good material objects from the end of the LB. Arrowheads and a wonderful scarab of Ramesses II that is very good for dating, since it was found in a stratum with the LB pottery as well. That gives you a good, 19th dynasty horizon for the end of the LB there at Hebron. This is one of my lab offices at BYU. You can see the sacks of Phil Hammond's pottery sitting on my shelves as we did the review of all of these things back around 2003, 2004, and rereading all of the pottery, photographing it, getting it ready so that we could talk about the LB at Hebron specifically. Here's a nice collage shot of some of the best the best samples. But the summum bonum of this was that in terms of indicative sherds from the LB, we wound up having more from both Area 1 and Area 6 than we had indicative sherds of the MB and of indicative sherds of the period immediately following the LB2, the Iron 1. And the reason that that's important is that the report that there was no LB at Hebron is not only untrue, but the report that the LB site here should be understood to mimic other sites where it is believed that the LB was a reduction in size and a reduction in population from what the MB had been is not shown in the pottery. We actually show a more robust pottery record in the LB than in the MB, which would indicate, if anything, that perhaps Hebron was more thriving in the LB than it had been in the MB when that particular Canaanite society had first more or less, invented itself. Because the Canaanite period really doesn't divide itself in its own mind between MB and LB. That's our artificial designation of it. Things start in the MB2 with Canaanite, and they go right up until what we would call the entry of Israel. And that whole period is spoken of retroactively in the Bible as the time when, quote, the Canaanite was still in the land. And they don't divide it, in Genesis between MB and LB the way that we do for our own purposes, mostly tied to Egyptian chronology. So that is an important indicator that Hebron at least starts in the MB during its Canaanite period, but actually grows into the LB. Okay, so from the Iron Age, we also have good material too, and I don't want to shortchange the Iron Age, but just to show you not only from the areas excavated, but from the tombs that Hammond dug. We have good samples of all the types of Iron Age things you'd expect to be, going right down to the end of Iron Age 2 and the heavily footed lamps that you see in the 7th century. I heard something. What was it?
No, I was just going to add to this point to make it more explicit from people that are maybe not familiar with terms like Middle Bronze and Late Bronze and all these things. The biblical text is really clear as to what Hebron is in terms of a significant site in the conquest narratives, which comprise both Joshua and Judges. Hebron is one of the ringleaders, along with Jerusalem, in Joshua chapter 10, that goes against Gibeon because Joshua has made an alliance with them. And over the course of that chapter, Joshua goes and fights various kings, but Hebron is one of those key elements, and it's actually the last city in that itinerary to fall in Joshua chapter 10. And if we look at this from the perspective of Joshua chapter 12, which is the slain kings list, which is a very weird chapter just to read. It says King X 1 killed by Joshua, King X 2, killed by Joshua, and it gives all these lists. But if we look at the history and the archaeology of these sites, this has been a longstanding debate about the conquest model and so on, mainly back in the 80s or so on. But the thought is there's all these exceptions that don't present late Bronze Age occupation or destruction. And, Hebron's added to that list, Jericho's added to that list, and so on. But once you actually look at what we see now archaeologically from looking at excavations and surveys, is that almost every single one of the 30 some odd towns in that list were not only occupied in the late Bronze Age, but were the most important Middle Bronze and late Bronze Age sites in all of the land of Canaan. And so when we talk about Hebron as a site that has, as you're showing here, significant late Bronze Age remains, and only that, a destruction, we're going into this question of, is the destruction of Joshua historical? Is it not historical? All those questions are, I think, really hard to put our thumb down on. But if we just simply limit the question to, does Joshua 12 represent a map of the land of Canaan that's consistent with the end of the late Bronze Age of the Canaanite world? And the answer is yes, of course. And if you compare that to Joshua 15, 20 through 63, which is what I wrote my dissertation on, which 40% of the sites or 35% of the sites have late Bronze Age and all of them have Iron Age, it presents two very different maps and pictures. And so I think it's not just through looking at the specific site, which you've done amazing work here in giving us that, but then taking a look back and then seeing how that look of the late Bronze Age world compares to these texts that have sort of been discarded by different archaeological theories about the Bible and so on over the years. I think it's actually worth looking at it again to try and make sense of what that text is even indicating and showing by mentioning these different towns.
I absolutely agree. I have full confidence that the text in Joshua is giving us an accurate accounting of what was remembered in the 7th century about the 13th and 12th centuries. And from my experience, and I will say this, knowing something about Jericho and Kenyon and Hammond that most people don't, that you probably have more evidence at Jericho than anyone's willing to admit, even in view of what's been published recently.
Yeah, we actually recently have been discussing that, Chris and I, and it's this myth that has grown up, I think, for grad students that there is no LB Jericho, so it wasn't destroyed. And Kenyon basically proved that and critiqued the Bible. But you go back and look at her own writings, she says, yeah, there was some LB there, and it could have worked with the biblical picture. And we actually know from more recent excavations there clearly was LB, and the city was destroyed.
That should be a whole other episode, because
yes,
Hammond was there and excavated LB material in situ from surfaces running to the MB wall. Okay. And he has a funny story to tell about Kenyon's attitude toward it. But we'll leave that for later. Well, let me just bump through some stuff here, leaving Avi Ofer and his MB finds behind, to the Eisenberg finds in the blue area up at the top of the visual there. And there you see, kind of in the upper right-hand area of that black and white shot, the remains of the MB2 city wall as it turns the corner around the north side of the tell, and the remains of the much earlier early Bronze Age 3 city wall that Eisenberg excavated. And also then center image, the remains of the Iron Age 2 4-room house there. There's a picture of Emanuel Eisenberg, who was one heck of an archaeologist and just a great all-around guy. I really admire him. And he and I are standing there in front of what he uncovered in 2014 of the Cyclopean, and I'm talking Cyclopean in capital letters, masonry of the south side of the city wall of Hebron. I want to show you a little bit about that here as we move on. But this was first found in Area 3 that Hammond excavated in 1964. And that is now 60 years ago, to think about it. In fact, this is fun to do this because this is like a 60th anniversary of these finds that never got the press that they should have at the time, but are just so key to understanding what's going on. There's Hammond. The yellow arrow is showing him standing atop a terrace fill that was put in by locals into the still standing masonry of the huge MB2 gate tower along the south side of the city wall. And that stonework is still in place today. That picture was taken in 1964. There is a little bit of what you would almost surely recognize. The yellow arrow here is pointing to some stonework at the very top of the ancient masonry, which is not Cyclopean MB, but which is header and stretcher iron 2 repair. And that's a very important thing. The MB2 wall that was built around Hebron survived with repairs until the Iron Age 2C, and was around that city in much the way that Jerusalem's MB2 walls were enhanced and came right down to the Babylonian destruction, and in much the way, say, that Gath's MB walls continued right down to the end of Iron Age 2A, and other MB2 walls at cities from, Shechem to Gezer, continue. Here is excavating the wall adjacent to the MB2 masonry. In other words, where Hammond is standing there and where you see that yellow arrow, if you look down from that in 1964, you see below the MB wall excavating the top of the EB city wall, which abuts the outside of the MB2 city wall. So it's not like it was in Eisenberg's area in the north of the tell, where there's just a slight gap between the two. Here, they run right against each other. And the MB2 wall was built on the inside face of the much earlier EB wall remains. So I put this little visual together to show you basically an upright and a flat plane view, okay? The upright view is the black and white picture with Hammond standing atop the MB2 wall remains, when, if you came out flat from the bottom of that photograph, what you would see is the EB3 wall top, and that's the drawing of it as it comes out from where the MB2 wall abuts the inside of it. Okay? And there then is what was excavated in 1966. And it's weird because they had to leave this olive tree that was growing right there in the middle of the wall untouched. The landowner wouldn't let them excavate the olive tree, so they excavated angularly around the olive tree to get the interior masonry of the MB2 city wall, and they caught a doorway that you can see right there at the top. Okay? And that then allowed them to suggest what almost everybody agrees is the case now with this particular area, that this very, very thick representation here is not all MB wall, it's an MB tower with an interior chamber. Okay? And that's the way that we reconstruct that. And this was these were some of the contributions that I made to Hammond's work as we moved from my dissertation forward. So this kind of has come out in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. I suggested that probably there was a similar tower next to it, because where you have the EB wall, you see that the EB wall truncates on its western side. And the MB wall was built right up against it. and the EB wall does not underrun the MB wall. They're both built on bedrock, and this wall truncates. And there's no reason for the truncation of a wall in this area unless it marked a place where you passed through it. Okay? So this would have been essentially the EB gate area here as we rebuild it. And this then, I speculate, would have been where an MB gate was, although I'm not at all confident that I have it reconstructed right. This is just speculation. But Ophir got a little bit of a wall over here in 1986 that fit nicely into the picture of there being a fortification on this side. Now, the situation, as we understand it, has changed since then, but this was the model that I created for the MB wall of Hebron, with the MB stonework actually drawn in there on what we speculatively reconstruct as the MB tower of the gate area, and the remains of the EB wall here below it. And the EB wall from bedrock to its top was only about 2 meters or so high, which is not effective enough to be a real barrier. So either the EB wall was partially destroyed, or it served as the base for a brick wall, which is not impossible in the hill country, although I think that the chances of that are a little slimmer. But it's the MB wall that really interests here, because it would have been the MB wall and possibly even this gate area that the editor of Genesis 23 had in mind when he pictures Abraham purchasing the cave of Machpelah in the gate of the city. Isn't that a fun type of a thing there? So this is where we reconstruct from the area that Hammond dug, where you have the EB and the MB walls, and another area where he picked up parts of the EB and the MB wall front here in Area 7, and speculating just due to the topography of the tell, how it runs around here and would connect then with the areas that Eisenberg found in 1999. And then you can see all of the other areas of excavation, particularly the ones that were done inside the city, which would be most critical to understanding the history of the site. And there is yours truly, when that shirt still fit, that American Expedition khaki shirt, on top of those MB2 remains. And that's actually the corner of the tower. And those stones are still in place today after 30 and 40 years. This is what is known as Wall 1. Wall 2 would be the EB wall, which was buried over by the landowners, and all of this rubble was placed on it. So you can only see just small stones here sticking out of the EB wall where it butts the face of the MB wall. But there it is in 2014, having been cleared. The only problem is that Eisenberg did not clear below the line that you see there, so the EB wall still remains reburied. The landowner reburied it around 1970. There was a huge bunch of rocks put on top of it there to keep this terrace from falling away. And so Eisenberg removed that rock terrace, but he didn't go down and reveal the EB wall, which was excavated in its entirety down to bedrock by Hammond. Okay, but there you see where the red arrow is in the visual, some of the big stones underneath the 80s, 90s era tumulus there of the EB wall that abutted the MB wall.
And you can also see how fast an olive tree grows in 20 years.
Yeah, you can. That olive tree is still there, still the only resident of the MB Tower in that area, and I still love to go see it anytime I can get down there. There is a section looking north and looking west of how the EB wall, which is Wall 2, and the area which Hammond excavated, abuts the MB wall, which is known as Wall 1. And this is looking west, so you can see it in section phrase. And there in the red arrow are the two stones that you see in that photograph. And there it is looking north in north section with the EB wall remains on top of bedrock, okay, in front of the MB, much taller MB wall remains, which abut the EB wall on the EB walls inside. And this is, again, looking from the top of the MB structure down to when the EB wall was being more fully revealed, and when they're going down to bedrock, and you can see all the bulk tags still there. This is very good 1960s stuff. Very Kenyon Wheeler method going on here. And also it became evident that the top of this EB structure had been refitted and refurbished in Iron Age 2. In other words, the EB structure, which was still nominally visible in terms of the top of it was known to exist in the Iron 2, appears to have been reutilized in Iron 2 as an outside fortification, strengthening the wall line of the old MB wall. This probably in anticipation of an Assyrian attack. Okay, this is probably part of Hezekiah's effort to make sure that walls were fortified. Here is Hammond's section, okay, of the EB wall. And this is now looking west, so this is section west. So here you see the south side or the outside of the EB wall all the way down to bedrock. And you can see that it's a good 2 meters high, surviving above bedrock. And this is just the kind of crazy stuff I had to deal with as a PhD graduate student, coming to understand this. And the way that they used to dig things, they didn't put any annotations in the drawings. All of the elevations and all of the loci were recorded in different documents than in the drawings. And sometimes with digs that lie unprocessed for 30 years, you're missing material too. So this was very challenging to get the information on this. But I drew, for publication purposes, a simplified version of that stratigraphy with its associated eras. And you can see then that you have the EB wall built on bedrock, the EB phases that actually probably came right up to the wall, but then were pierced when the MB wall, in the MB, when the wall appears to have been cleared away so that you could find where the bedrock was to make the decision whether to build on the outside of this wall or the inside of the wall. And ultimately they built on the inside of the wall. But then with that MB piercing down through the EB layer to get to bedrock, you have then a steady MB, LB, LB2, iron, LB iron 1 transition phase that ran up to it, iron 1 that ran to it, iron 2 that ran to it, and the iron 2 then cleared away the iron 1 material in order to expose more of the wall so that it could be refurbished in iron 2B as an extra fortification. So this stratigraphy is really important. And there again, you see just let me just show you some things now from Hammond's Area 7 that are very hard to find. But here is a picture then of the city walls eastward continuation. And what you see is the upper structure with Iron Age 2 masonry atop the EB structure. And this, by the way, is exactly what Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo found in 2014, except that they didn't dig down to find the EB portion of it. They more or less just revealed the Iron 2 portion of it that was the overbuild, and concluded that that entire line had been built in the Iron 2, when in fact, in the two areas that Hammond dug to bedrock, he demonstrated that underneath that was good EB material, including EB masonry. So here then in yellow are the areas that Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo dug, and that's what they revealed, okay? The Iron Age 1 cap and frontal, almost like an Iron 1, Iron Age 2 front jacket to the top of what was essentially an EB structure here that abutted the MB structure that was built on the EB structures inside. And there then you see that incredible Cyclopean masonry put in place probably the 18th century BC, okay? Maybe the 17th, but more likely the 18th, that would have gone much higher into the air absolutely much higher into the air, and would have been, according to some writers, as if, you know, it stretched to heaven, at least for anyone standing at the base of it. And so that's what I suggest then in dealing with, here's David Ben Shlomo, by the way, for those of you who don't know him, just a wonderful guy and a top-notch excavator and pottery expert if you ever need one. Here is the line of the EB wall with iron 2 overbuild, okay, up against what would be the line of the MB wall, and that's what you just saw in that photograph. Now, this is the way that I reconstructed in terms of the walls that we reconstruct from Hammond's Dig going around to meet Eisenberg's on the north, and the area then that can be demonstrably said to have been refurbished in the Iron Age 2, possibly in anticipation of a hostile attack, maybe close to the year 700 BC, let's say. The proposed gateway, however, seems to have been blocked at that point. And here is an interesting detective story, because when Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo worked in 2014, what they found was that here you have MB Wall 1, and here you have MB Wall 18, still the Cyclopean stonework, and it comes almost to what I would call a straight seam right there. Can you see that? In fact, I'll just put a line there so you can see the difference in masonry on the right-hand side from the left-hand side. And that is clearly Iron Age masonry, and as they revealed more of it, there's maybe the slant showing what's really going on. As they revealed more of it in that 2000 dig, and they invited me to be on site as they did this. They said, Jeff, come down. We're going to dig along this wall. We know you're interested. Come and see it. And I even got to jump in there and do a little troweling. So just a little bit of excavation help there. But there's both Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo in front of the modern archaeological tool, revealing the wall line just to see where it went. This was not at all a stratigraphic effort. Okay, they're on a timetable here. They're trying to get ready for a park, and this was just a question that they had to answer my personal desire to know what happens to the east of that gate tower. And it appears that if there was an entry there, and I think there was, it was blocked. So as that we get further along there, we find that it's all an Iron Age wall. Okay. And there you can see, as you dig further, there's the MB stonework. And from about right here, it's Iron Age coming all this way. And you can see it's good squared blocks. So what's going on with my gateway? It's clearly been filled in. Or maybe in the Iron 2, the gateway didn't exist at all after a certain point. So here are the two possibilities that I now deal with, which is that number one, the gate towers should probably have been placed further apart in my model, and that the gateway was filled in the Iron 2, either in the Iron 2B as a matter of fortifying the city better, or in the Iron 2C, okay, when the city is rebuilt after the Assyrians destroyed it anyway. And I think we can demonstrate that we have an Assyrian destructive event at Hebron. Or maybe the gate tower doesn't exist at all in this area and can't be excavated because this gateway was destroyed by the Assyrians. And then when the site was rebuilt in the 7th century, the Iron Age wall simply filled in this area and continued around the east side of the city. In any case, every time we excavate, we find something different that changes our models. Okay. Now, why would a gate tower and an MB wall disappear? Okay, one possibility is that earthquake injures the area, and we know there was a robust earthquake in the middle of the 8th century. We find it at Gath. I think we can demonstrate that it happened at Hebron as well. Very well known from Jerusalem as well, due to our colleague Joe Uziel's work there. But the other thing is the Assyrian campaign, when it says that Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities, which surely also must have included Hebron, and took them. And if it was an Assyrian event that damaged and essentially destroyed the proposed Eastern Gate Tower there. Then when Hebron is rebuilt in the time of Josiah, 80 years later, they don't rebuild that as a gate. They simply continue the wall line from the surviving tower and probably enter the city over by the water, where there undoubtedly was another water gate on the east side. Okay. Plausibly, the destruction in Area 6 that we see, which I haven't talked about, would have been a result of the earthquake, and plausibly a reason for header and stretcher masonry being added to the MB wall was in the aftermath of the 8th century earthquake that would have damaged the old Cyclopean wall. But I think very probably that the reason for a gate blockage or the disappearing of an Eastern Gate Tower would have been due to the Assyrian aftermath, the Assyrian attack, and the aftermath and rebuilding that must surely have taken place during the zenith of Josiah's time. In any case, let me wrap this up. You can read all about this because we have put out a good report now about Hebron in the early and Middle Bronze Age, particularly focusing on the fortification walls of the found by the American expedition. And this was in the er-Rumeide Festschrift, which, Chris, you will know probably better than any person on earth since you edited it. And what a job that was, because that is a high chair book right there. But you can read about this stuff now. It's published, and you can read. We have maps, of course, showing that we have early Bronze and Middle Bronze Hebron and Late Bronze Hebron, and the Late Bronze Hebron is discussed in a recent edition of that came out from De Gruyter, edited by Aaron Mayer and Itzhak Shai and the great Chris McKinny, called The Late Bronze and Early Iron Ages of Southern Canaan, and Hebron in the Late Bronze Age, and the discoveries of the AEH are outlined there, if anyone would like to read them. There's also a forthcoming publication on Hebron in Iron Age 1 and Iron Age 2, which is the write-up that's now, forthcoming, will be in press soon, from a conference on urbanism in the Iron Age at the Bar-Ilan University just a couple of years ago. So we're looking forward to that one as well. You also have the final publication of the 2014 excavations by Eisenberg and Ben Shlomo, which is available, and I highly recommend it. It is a superb work and really shows a lot about what was happening with those Middle Bronze fortifications, and also with Hebron robustly represented in the unfortified city of the Second Temple period. So that's it. And let me poke in one last word here, if I could, because we will forever have people that are proposing other ways of seeing things. And as you know, our veteran colleague, good friend, David Usishkin, redates almost everything there is in the Hill Country, including all of the fortifications, to Iron Age 2. He would redate the fortifications at Jerusalem to late Iron 2, not even early Iron Age 2, as some people are suggesting, maybe for a small portion of the Gihon, but the late Iron 2. And he does the same for the Cyclopean wall at Hebron, and he specifically says that the thing that we identify as an early Bronze Age wall can't possibly be that late. It has to be from the Iron Age. My view of these types of studies is that you have to rely on relative stratigraphy and ceramic typology, and also on the typology of architecture and masonry. And that's a big issue in terms of identifying these Cyclopean walls that we find at Shechem, at Jerusalem, at Hebron, in all these places that we know originate in the MB2. Right? But with regard to relative stratigraphy and ceramic typology, what Usishkin ignores is simple reality. It is published, it is secure that Hammond reached bedrock in Area 3, and that in front of that wall, Wall 2, it goes to bedrock and was abutted by identifiable layers going all the way back to the Middle Bronze Age 2. And if I'm correct, the early Bronze 2-3 layer also reached there, but was simply cleared away a little bit in the MB2. And so you can't say that Wall 2 is an late Iron Age 2 wall. It was capped in the late Iron Age 2, but it was around since EB3 at least, and the wall inside it, the MB2 wall, abuts it and indeed dates to the MB2, and Hammond demonstrated that as well. And that's where I will leave that. When considering the Iron Age fortifications of urban Hebron, do not be surprised if one day it is found that all of that that's been dug by Eisenberg and Shlomo has EB beneath it when you finally decide to dig to bedrock. So thank you, everybody, and best wishes from Hebron. Best wishes to my great colleagues, Chris and Kyle.
Jeff, thanks so much. I would just add, in listening to this, and direct our listeners to the previous podcast we had, which we'll put in the description, about giants there, that really these walls shouldn't be called Cyclopean walls. They should be called Anakim walls. These should be that's what the judges describes them as. So
Homot Anaki. Homot
exactly.
Anaki.
Because the Cyclops is the one with the single eye, and this comes from Greek mythology of
that's maybe
of building
Gath,
the walls.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It works with Gath. So this is fantastic to see.
Hey, by the way, let me just poke in, Chris, that I am not unfamiliar working with early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age city walls. And Chris and Kyle know this very well, because I've excavated huge chunks of EB and MB city walls, which, by the way, were used, the EB is reused in the MB at Gath as well. This is a thing that happened regularly, that MB walls were often built along pre-existing EB lines.
Right. And I would say, and as you go through this presentation, that was immediately what I was thinking of, is the summit of Tel Asafi Gath in Area F, where you excavated for so many years, and how that was actually much more complicated when compared to this. I'm not saying it's relatively straightforward, but it's not the slope that you have at Area F. So yeah, I agree that you should have a great deal of confidence in what
You've heard of living on the edge. I dig along a cliff,
Exactly. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up, Jeff. But thanks so much for taking the time to share with us your excavations. And the main thing is, I look forward to seeing you in the field sometime this summer and hanging out and go check out a new site.
Well, we got to run back. There was a fire at Lecky, so we got to go see it now. See if stuff has grown back up again.
That's right.
All right. Best wishes, everybody.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
Kyle, walk us out.
Yeah. So thank you, Jeff, again, for our listeners. You know it. Until next time, keep on digging.
You've been listening to OnScript's Biblical World podcast. If you enjoy this show, please show your support by giving us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen. You can support the show by visiting onscript.study/donate. Until next time, keep digging.